Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk about our project, trying to reintroduce Atlantic salmon back to a few rivers in Atlantic Canada. We're working in what's called the Inner Bay of Fundy population. So here's a map of Atlantic Canada, and in that blue outline is what we call the Inner Bay of Fundy. So the Bay of Fundy, the world's largest tides in the world, and so this is a unique population that resides only in this area. So what makes kind of these Inner Bay of Fundy salmon unique? Well, if we look at the typical migration of salmon from Atlantic Canada, they follow this migration pattern where they leave the rivers, they travel up to the North Atlantic off the coast of Greenland, and there's a very significant multi-sea winter component of these populations. Whereas the Inner Bay of Fundy salmon are very, very different. So they don't take this big, long migration. They stay within the Bay of Fundy or the Gulf of Maine. So they have this very short migratory pattern. Now, of course, as we know with salmon, for every absolute, there's a million exceptions. So there are some examples of fish leaving the bay, but in general, they don't leave the Bay of Fundy or the Gulf of Maine. They have this very small migration. And so as a result, it's mostly a one-sea winter population. So about 60% of the smolts that leave will return the following year as mature grills. So what makes this population so endangered? So it's actually listed under the Species at Risk Act in Canada, so these are protected species. There was once a historic run of about 40,000 individuals across these 45 rivers that make up the Inner Bay of Fundy, or the Inner Bay of Fundy population. Now there's an estimated about 200 wild individuals, and I do mean 200 individuals across 45 rivers. So it's a critically endangered population. Most rivers are extirpated. There's really only about 4 rivers out of that 45 left that have salmon left in them. Of course, marine survival is considered to be one of the most limiting factors. Right now, the return rate or the survival rate is about 0.05%. So it's really, really low. And so as a result of this population crashing to almost extinction, there was a program installed called the Live Gene Bank. And really the point of the Live Gene Bank was to preserve the remnant genetic populations, conserve those genetics to avoid extinction. And they've done a very good job. Those remnant families have been preserved, and they're still maintained in hatcheries. Although those fish have been tried to be released, and they're just not recovering the population. So the population still is remaining at a very, very critically low state. And so to give you an idea of what the Live Gene Bank is, so in the late 90s, they went out to these remnant rivers, or these remnant rivers that had remnant populations, collected the last smolts leaving those rivers, took them to federal hatcheries, like this one here, this operated by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And so they go through the captive breeding process, and then they would subsequently release those offspring as fry or par or even some adults. And so this breeding process is very intensive. So it's done there's a lot of genetic profiling, and so it's a real pedigreed mating plan. So there's a lot that goes into it, and it's really designed to, again, conserve those genetics, those remnant genetics. So during all this and through this Live Gene Bank program, there was a study done looking at kind of these various release strategies. So releasing par or releasing fry or smolt. And what Clark et al. Found was that when you increase captivity or captive exposure at these early life stages, or decrease the wild exposure, you're actually decreasing fitness. And so they were looking at fitness as a measure of smolt size. As we've already heard, the size of smolts really matter. And so if you're releasing fish as par, the smolts that result are quite small relative to their wild counterparts. And so this really led to the idea, and I think it really follows nicely with what Ian was talking about, is that when you have captive reared fish, you're reducing that wild fitness. And so how do we get more eggs into a river? How do we get more wild eggs into the river? We could plant them, but there's complications. And let's face it, salmon can do it better. They've evolved to do this. And that's really what led us to our project and our kind of recovery plan, if you will, or strategy. And so it's called the Fundy Salmon Recovery Plan or Strategy. And I'm going to walk you through this roadmap of how we do this. So again, we started with nothing. So the rivers that we're working at in Fundy National Park, and I'll go through those in a minute, really had no fish left. The adult returns were 0, maybe get 1 fish coming back. So there's really no fish there. So if we didn't do something, if we didn't put fish there, there would be no fish there. So because we were part of the live gene bank, we had those remnant genetics around, so we could take some fish from the live gene bank, release them as unfed fry, again trying to minimize that early captive exposure, release them in the river, collect those smolts as they're leaving, and then take those smolts to a marine rearing facility. And I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail in a second as well. Once those fish reach maturity, they're released back into the river, and once we release them into the river, they're on their own. And so now they can undergo all those natural selection pressures, natural mate choice. Those eggs are, they're developing in the substrate. They emerge from the substrate. So when they come out, they are captive free at that point. So then we can go back, collect those smolts, take them back to the marine rearing facility, and complete that loop and try to rebuild our population that way. So we're hoping that by 2023, we'll have enough smolts from this project that we can kind of get off the live gene bank, the need for the live gene bank. Now we'll still keep that, or we'll still be a part of that, because we need it. That's our safety net. If something happens at our marine rearing facility, if all those fish die, that would be the end of the population. So we still need to be part of the live gene bank. We're still, maintaining that. But in terms of our restoration program, we'll try and get away from that captive exposure, the early captive exposure, and focus only on this marine side. So, like I said, we have this marine rearing facility, and so it's the world's first marine conservation farm. And I know we just heard a lot about aquaculture and escapes, but we set this up for a number of reasons. We needed to grow large numbers of adult salmon. They know how to do it very well. The hatchery facilities that we have in the province just aren't big enough to grow hundreds and hundreds of adult salmon, mature adult salmon, for us. So we needed a facility. And so we got one set up it's on the island of Grand Manan. And so on the map there you can see, again, we have the inner bay of Fundy. You can see where Fundy National Park is. And in the circle, that's the island of Grand Manan. So that's where we've set up or established this conservation farm. Now, what's unique about it is we created legislation for it. So it's designated as a wild conservation farm. So only wild fish can go there. No commercial aquaculture fish are allowed on site by law. And you can see it's very well protected. There's a natural seawall protecting it in a small inlet. So it is a very isolated location. The other nice aspect of this conservation farm is its location is on the west side of the island. And there's no aquaculture on that side of the island at all. So it's all on the eastern and southern tip. So it's quite a ways away from any of the aquaculture that's happening on the island. Through the establishment of this, we had to set up rigorous health testing. So before we can move any fish onto the farm, they have to go through health testing. Before they can come off, they have to go through health testing. And so there was a lot to get it set up. And so fish go there, they get stocked as smolts, they stay there for either 1 to 2 years, so either they mature as a grilse or as a multi-sea winter. After that, they have to leave, so they can't stay longer than that. If they're not mature after their second sea winter, they have to be released anyway, but by that time, we're at about 98% maturity anyway, so we're not really releasing too many immature fish at that point. So as you can imagine, there's a lot involved in a project like this. And so this really is a big collaboration. And to me, this is the biggest success of the project to date. So you can see there's 2 federal agencies, so Parks Canada and Fisheries and Oceans. So Parks Canada was a real driving force in this project early on. Fisheries and Oceans Canada, of course, they maintain that live gene bank, that safety net. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't have fish to work with. The province of New Brunswick, who regulates the site, or all aquaculture sites, so they were really instrumental in helping us develop this site and get it off the ground. The Atlantic Canada Fish Farmers Association, they really manage the project at the high level. Cook Aquaculture, love them or hate them, they've been an amazing partner in terms of operating our site, getting the site established, and really changing rearing practices to grow wild fish and promote maturity rather than suppress maturity. So we're getting close to that 60% mature gross stage or proportion. And then in the middle, there's Fort Folly First Nations. They're a really important partner because they work on the Petitcodiac River. And so if you look at the map on the bottom right, that kind of upper arm, that's the Petitcodiac River. And it is said that that river, it's the largest river in the Inner Bay, and it supported about 20% of the entire Inner Bay population. So it's really critical that we kind of get that river back online. The problem with that river is in 1969, they put a causeway and completely blocked it off, and so there was no salmon moving up or down. A number of years ago, they opened that causeway up finally so we could start trying to do some restoration, and it's in the process of being completely removed. So they're a little bit earlier on in their program stage, but they're already starting to see some positive results as well. Of course, we have the university to do some research and monitoring. And then this law enforcement coalition, which I think is another really amazing example of this collaboration. So when we started this, we're going to be releasing all these adult salmon into the river. The warden in the park got on board, and he's like, great, we can do this, we can protect these fish when we put them out there. And then as he starts to learn about salmon, he realizes they leave the river and he can't protect them anymore. So how do we look after these endangered species once they leave the river? And so he reached out to all the enforcement agencies in the province, got them together to form this coalition, and so that they all work now to protect these salmon once they leave the river, whether it's in the ocean, if they go to another river. And it may seem weird to have the RCMP or an off-road vehicle enforcement or something like that, or Environment Canada, which is typically environmental monitoring, to be part of this. But it's really just to be eyes and ears out there. So if somebody pulls over a car for speeding and they happen to have a salmon in their trunk, well, they're probably not supposed to have it because it's an endangered species and they can report it. So it's really just getting that word out there and letting people know that they are being watched, and so they can't, hopefully to deter the poaching activities. And this is just, I think, an amazing example of it. So like I said, so a lot of this work is happening in Fundy National Park, in these two rivers, the Upper Salmon River and the Point Wolf River. So on the Upper Salmon River, you can see those two yellow lines. Those are natural barriers that salmon can't get above. So these are relatively small rivers that we're working in. The Upper Salmon River only has about 12 kilometers of accessible salmon habitat. The Point Wolf River is a bit bigger. Of course, these watersheds extend outside the park, but so you can see the park boundary in blue. Again, there's two branches on the Point Wolf River as well. One has a barrier, complete barrier to salmon migration. The other branch, I would say, is a partial barrier, so most years salmon can't get above it, unless the water conditions are absolutely perfect, and they have been known to get above, but in most years they can't get above. So the nice thing is once these salmon go back into the river, they're pretty well maintained in the confines of the park, which helps in their protection. So as you can imagine, moving fish from the island back to the park, or to the park to the island and back, is a major undertaking. That trip is 275 kilometers one way. So they have to get on a big transport truck, they have to take a ferry off the island, then drive to the park. Once they get to the park, we have to load them into these bins, and then they get dropped into the river. I say dropped, they get placed very gently. The Coast Guard helicopter pilot is amazing how he can drop that huge bin right in front of you extremely gently. And one of the reasons why I have to use helicopters is it's a national park. There's not a lot of road access, so can't just drive a truck into the middle of the park to release these fish. So again, all those partners that I mentioned earlier are part of this, and everyone has a role to play. But I think you can see the fish going. One of the fish going in. The quality is pretty amazing. So here are the numbers that we've released to date. So in 2015 was the first year. They were mostly immature. And that was because we hadn't had our conservation farm set up yet, so we were still under traditional aquaculture rules, and so we couldn't keep them any longer, and we were still figuring this whole wild salmon raising thing going on. And then as numbers increased, we were putting more and more fish out. I should also mention that up until 2019, it was only into the Upper Salmon River, so that one river. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you is on that river, and that's primarily because most of the research has been done on that river. Even though it was a national park, there was an old mill dam on the mouth of the Point Wolf River that was there for quite some time, unfortunately, and so there wasn't a lot of work or restoration happening on that river, because again, it was pretty well completely blocked to salmon. And then last year was the first year that we actually started putting fish into both rivers, so we split them up 50-50 into both the Upper Salmon and Point Wolf rivers. And now this year we're projected to release another about 750 salmon. Again, we'll split them up into the two rivers. And I should mention that after that 2015, so basically from 2016 on, we're releasing mostly just mature fish. So of course there's always a few that slip through. So in September we usually go and do our sorts and sort the immatures from the matures. They get tagged. So we are pretty confident that we're releasing is pretty well just mostly mature fish. So once they go in the river, there's all kinds of monitoring that has to occur. Today I'm only going to talk to you about the salmon population and some of those highlights. Of course, there's a whole nother aspect of it, the ecological side of it, which is really more my forte. I'm much more of a freshwater ecologist, and that's how I got involved in this project early on, was to monitor the effects of having salmon back in the river and what does it mean to the ecosystem. Because again, this was initiated by Parks Canada, and they have mandates not only to restore endangered species, but to maintain ecosystems and ecosystem health and ecosystem integrity. And so that's a really big part of this program. So like I mentioned, every fish that we release has a pit tag, and so we set up these big pit antennas. These rivers, although very beautiful and very pristine, are very hateful when it comes to trying to put equipment in, and we can't keep equipment in very long. Anything we put in gets washed away in a single rain event, and so we have to be innovative. And so we've designed these really large swim-through antennas. The one on the Point Wolf River is 30 meters wide by 2 meters tall, so it's a swim-through antenna, no gaps. And they're designed to withstand these high water events. So in top right, you can see one that was from this year. That was just a single rain event, and you can see how high that water comes. And anything in the river just gets washed away, so we had to try and build it around that kind of floodplain. The other thing with these rivers is the amount of bed load movement. So they're very dynamic, and that substrate moves readily, and so having anything permanently anchored into the bottom, again, just doesn't stay. And then the third reason for these designs is it's a national park, so we can't have any real permanent structure, so we have to have something that's removable. And although it looks fairly permanent, by mid-December we pulled these antennas out, and there's really very little trace that we were there. The upside to having a population that is virtually extirpated is we know every single adult individual that's there, so we can get all kinds of amazing data on the entire population. The downside is there's no fish there, so we have to put them there. So this year is, I guess, a highlight year for us. So it's the largest adult return in over 30 years. So we've had 105 adult salmon return to date. I'd say it's not done yet because we usually get another pulse in end of September, October, so hopefully we'll see some more fish coming back. So there's just a breakdown of the two rivers. The blue line, that's the water levels, and so you can see when we get a little pulse of rain, some of those fish were moving in. This was also the earliest year on record of an adult salmon returning to the park, so we had one come back July 1st, which is the earliest we've ever had, so that's encouraging as well that we're getting these early fish back. I think another really interesting part is, so early on we did some genetic studies to look at success, and what we found is that these adults that return to spawn again, contribute almost 40% of the next generation, which is quite high. So when we put fish in, and some of those few adults that are returning are really making up the difference. And that was, when we saw that 40%, that was only with 15 adults returning. So although we put these fish in and they're spawning and contributing to the next generation, it's really those ones that make it out to the ocean, survive, and come back that are really driving our juvenile population. Of these 105 that have returned this year, 62% are from that marine farm. So like I mentioned, we still have that live gene bank, so we still have fish in the freshwater environment that are surplus or non-targets, I should say. We're not allowed to use surplus, word surplus. They're non-targeted fish, so they get released to spawn as well. But they don't seem to come back at nearly the same rate. So, way more than half, almost a third of the fish returning are from the marine facility. And a really high proportion of these returning fish are female, which is great. Because again, it goes to what Ian was saying. Not only are these big females are coming back, so it's really promising. And this idea of fish switching between rivers, I think, is fascinating. So even though they were released into one river, they're coming back to both, or moving back and forth to see which is their kind of the home river. And like I mentioned earlier, there's that the work that Fort Folly is doing on the Petitcodiac River. So they're following a similar program, and we actually had 3 of their fish return to our river this year, which I think is really, really interesting. There's some strain. They came in, they spent about a week, and then they left. And one of those fish was picked back up in the Petitcodiac. So I'm guessing they were just poking around. Wasn't their river. They left, and at least one of them went back to their home river. So. It's really neat to see. So what does this return mean so far in terms of kind of historic populations? Well, you can see once the numbers were quite good, and then they went to virtually zero. Some of those years between that 96 and 2001 are zeros, and other years they just didn't have any assessment. So they're not all zeros, but there were many, and you can see the populations were relatively low. So there was a pilot project done in about 2010, 2011. Basically, it was to look at, can we rear these fish in a marine facility and release them successfully? And so you can see there was some responding, or a number of adults returning from that. That was only 2 years. As soon as it stopped, we had no more adults coming back. And then in 2015 is when we started what we're calling the Fundy Salmon Recovery Project as it looks now. And so that's when we really had these large-scale adult releases, and our numbers of adults returning has, more or less gone up each year. And, that's now finally starting to translate into increased juvenile densities. And so we have the largest recorded juvenile density in the park, which we're really happy with. Should note, so there was juvenile stocking that had been done early on as part of this live gene bank, and which wasn't resulting in anything promising. Again, there's a gap where they just weren't doing juvenile surveys. So it's not that there weren't any juveniles in the river. The numbers were low, they just weren't surveying them. But you can see even with large numbers of juveniles being released, and they were releasing on average 200,000 juveniles a year, whether it's fry or par. That wasn't really resulting into a whole lot. Then we started these adult releases, and now we're starting to see an increase in our juvenile density. And I think what's really amazing, and that we're proud of, is that the Upper Salmon River is the only river in the entire inner Bay of Fundy that has exclusively wild hatched salmon. So all the juveniles in that river were hatched in the wild. We didn't put them there, we put the adults there. We helped put those adults there, but they spawned on their own. Those eggs were laid in the gravel and emerged from there. So they are exclusively wild hatched, and it's the only one in the inner Bay of Fundy right now. And then, of course, we look at the smolts, and so again, in the mid 2010, there were some really good smolt runs, better than they are now. But again, that was a result of a lot of that stocking of juveniles and adults at that time. So they're not all wild hatched, and now the smolts that we're producing are exclusively wild hatched. So again, these are kind of the best of the best that we could produce. And again, this is a fairly involved intervention. But again, if we didn't do it, these would all be zeros. So it's not like there's other rivers that you can kind of, well, should we do it or should we not? We had no choice. And I think that's a really important part to remember. So again, like I said, there's lots of ecological monitoring going on. I won't get into it. That's a whole other talk in itself. We are looking at primary productivity, secondary productivity, how that productivity relates or translates into juvenile production and size and growth. So there's a lot of work going on that front. I have a number of grad students working on that. So it's maybe a shameless plug for my grad students and some of the work that they're doing. So where do we go from there? So we kind of told you where we started, why we got to where we got to, what we're doing, and some of our results. And now this program is evolving and growing into a multi-park project. And how this came about was we're doing all this work in Fundy and talking to their parks. Well, they all have salmon. They all have salmon programs, but everyone was doing something different. Everyone had different mandates. Nobody was talking to one another. And so the idea was to bring all these parks, all these projects kind of under one umbrella and to start looking at common metrics across the parks. And so one of the really kind of, I guess, maybe unique features is across this parks you have a gradient of population statuses. So in Terra Nova on that far top right-hand corner, that's actually a recovered population. It had declined significantly, and through a lot of hard work and community effort and intervention, not only has that population rebounded, but they're actually fishing it, and there's retention fishery on that river once again. So it's a great example of kind of, that's our benchmark to Fundy, which was extirpated. And you have every kind of everything in between. And so we can look at things across this population gradient. We can look at things across an ecological gradient. And there's different interventions or restoration activities going on. So Kouchibakwak, for example, they're doing a lot of egg planting. So we can look at the differences between releasing adults versus releasing eggs. Cape Breton is also thinking about doing, or I shouldn't say thinking about, they are starting an adult release program. Gros Morne is in need of doing some kind of intervention, and they're still trying to work through that. So we can look at not only the different population status and all these other gradients, but different interventions, and maybe we can start to glean an idea of when do we do something? When is it too late? We know Fundy was too late. When they did something, it was at least 5 years too late, probably 10 years too late. But when is the best time? We don't know. And so we're hoping that by looking at these multiple parks and multiple geographic locations, we can start to figure out some of these questions. And we've talked about it. I know I've talked I talked to many people about this idea of trying to connect people with salmon again. Salmon has been lost from at least for Fundy National Park for a long time, and the communities around the park have no connection with it. They don't care when we talk about doing salmon restoration. They're like, why do we bother? We can't see them, we can't fish them, they've lost all connection. And so we're really trying to bring that connection back. And so we have a number of initiatives. So in the spring we have a salmon research open house. So the community members and people at large can come and listen and hear what we're doing, see some of the tools that we're doing, and kind of get immersed into that. We have a lot of citizen science programs happening in the park. So everything from invertebrate collections to predatory birds and even other predators. And I know it sounds counterintuitive that we want predators, but this is a national park, and predators are part of the natural ecosystem, and they should be there, and we need them there. And we're actually starting to see more birds of prey, especially eagles and osprey, in the park. And they're learning that when they see the trucks coming and they know that there's salmon coming and they're there. And it's, maybe disheartening to see one of our precious salmon taken by an eagle, but that's part of it, and it's great. And, we can still find the pit tag, and we can still get that information. And so it's all part of the ecosystem. And the last one is Swim with Salmon. It's probably my favorite one. And so that's where we take visitors to the park. So they sign up, they apply because there's limited space. But we get them all suited up and we take them to one of the spots and we teach them how to do a snorkel survey. And we already know that there's fish there. We've already, we made sure that they're going to get some experience. But we can get some of that citizen science, but it just connects them. And it's so hard. Salmon are tough, fish are tough. You can't see them in the water. And so by putting these people in the river, letting them snorkel, see these endangered species in their natural environment, the connection that they make is incredible. And the number of side projects or talks that we've given to classes and groups and things like that, getting people excited again about salmon, is all stemming from this, especially the Swim with Salmon. So it's a real, I think, critical part of connecting people back with these species, especially in the park. And it's a lot of fun. Who doesn't like swimming with salmon? So there's a million people to thank. If I tried to put everybody's name on there, it'd be pages and pages, and it wouldn't be interesting to see. So I thought I'd put up pictures of the different aspects, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of fun. You can see work being done at the sea cages, and yeah. So we have a really great time doing it. And the last thing I will show is, hopefully it'll play. So this is right after one of our releases. Literally after the last fish went in, did a snorkel to make sure the fish were doing well. So you can see the state they're in, the condition, and it's just wonderful to see a pool that would have had this many or more salmon in it, that was empty for decades, having fish back in it. Of course, like I said, it was right after, so they kind of mill about. Within about 2 days, they disperse through the river, and there's maybe 5 fish left in the pool. So they really do move, and we've tracked them with radio tags and things like that. So we do know quite a bit about where they move and what they do. But yeah, so this is what our rivers are starting to look like. So thank you very much.